Jeremy Thatcher, Dragon Hatcher by Bruce Coville. Chapter 1. Love Letter of Doom. Jeremy Thatcher crumpled his paper in disgust. The dragon he'd been drawing looked like a dog with wings. "Be right back," he whispered to his friend, Specimen. But as he started toward the paper cupboard, a sharp voice asked, "Something wrong, Mr. Thatcher?" Jeremy froze. One of the problems with having Mr. Kravitz for art was that you never knew when it was safe to get a fresh sheet of paper. Clearly, this was not one of those days. The tall, pudgy teacher lumbered over to stand in front of Jeremy. "Didn't you hear the board has frozen spending?" he asked. "That means no new paper orders for the rest of the year. So tell me, is that sheet of paper needed because your drawing is that bad, or because your talent is so important?" Mr. Kravitz gave Jeremy a smug, nasty smile and waited for him to answer. Jeremy hesitated. He wanted to say that his talent was that important, but he knew that answer would only bring more scorn. He decided to say nothing. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, he turned and shambled back to his seat. As Jeremy slid into his chair, Specimen pointed to a square of lavender paper tucked under the corner of Jeremy's books. "From Mary Lou Retton," he whispered. "Special delivery." Jeremy hesitated the urge to reach and grab the note. No sense in giving Mr. Kravitz something else to complain about, he thought to himself. But what am I supposed to do now? The paper's gone, Mr. Kravitz won't let me get more, and I've got 15 minutes to go before art is over. His eyes drifted to the back, to the note. He found himself reaching toward the paper. Quickly, he drew his hand back. "Where's Mr. Kravitz?" he thought to himself. Looking around, Jeremy spotted the art teacher bending over Jin Megan's desk, probably telling him in detail what's wrong with his picture, thought Jeremy. Pretending to look at something else, he tugged the lavender square from its hiding place, unfolded it, and began to read the note. Before Jeremy could finish, Mr. Kravitz came up and snatched the note from his fingers. "Well, Mr. Thatcher," he said gleefully, "I see you've forgotten my feeling about notes in the classroom." Jeremy's cheeks began to burn. "Give it back," he said. "I'm afraid I can't do that," replied Mr. Kravitz with a mock of sincerity. "It's against my rules. However, since you didn't have a chance to read it to yourself, I will read it out loud before I destroy it." "Don't!" Jeremy cried in terror. But Mr. Kravitz had begun. "Dear Jeremy," he read in a mincing tone, "I think you're incredibly cute, even if you are the shortest boy in 6th grade. I'm going to kiss you after school today if it's the last thing I ever do." Mr. Kravitz paused, and then he said, "Oh, yes, there is a P.S. According to this note, you have beautiful eyes." The classroom rocked with laughter. Jeremy closed his beautiful eyes. His face was so hot that even the tips of his ears were burning. Mr. Kravitz folded the note and tucked it into his pocket. "No need to embarrass the person who wrote this by reading her signature. Let's just remember that notes are not appreciated in this classroom." The injustice made Jeremy's head spin. For trying to read a note that someone else had given him, he was made to suffer complete humiliation, but the person who sent the note is getting off the hook with only a warning? What's going on here? It didn't take him long to figure out the answer. Mary Lou's father was on the school board, so Mr. Kravitz wasn't going to embarrass her. Jeremy quivered at the unfairness of it all. There's a nice pause right here. We've talked about this before. When there's a big space in between the paragraphs, we know that time has gone on, so now it's later on in the day. "That stinks," he said to Specimen that afternoon. "Stinks, stinks, stinks." "I agree," said Specimen, pushing his thick glasses with a long, grubby forefinger. But then, everyone knows Kravitz hates you. Jeremy sighed. All I ever wanted to do was be an artist, and the only teacher who's ever really disliked me is my art teacher. I want to know why. Specimen shrugged. Forget it. Just be glad he isn't judging the art contest. Jeremy nodded. He and Spess had been trying to win the spring art contest for years. First prize was the chance to paint the main window of Zambrino's department store. Jeremy believed he had the best entry for the last 2 years. He hadn't won, though, because the top spot traditionally went to a 6th grader, whether or not they were actually the best artist. Now, he was a 6th grader, so this was going to be his year. He was the best artist in school, and everyone except Mr. Kravitz knew it. The only person who might possibly beat him was Specimen, and they had already decided that whichever one of them won, the other would help with the painting. However, that didn't take care of his current problem. The fact that everyone in 6th grade knew that Mr. Kravitz was a creep had done nothing to protect Jeremy from the teasing that followed the public reading of Mary Lou's love note. Specimen was the only one that had shown him any sympathy. The other boys, particularly Howard Morton and Freddie the Frog Killer, were razzing him unmercifully. Now that was nothing new. Maybe you should tell everyone you sent their note. Maybe you should tell everyone who sent the note, suggested Specimen. Are you out of your mind? Before his friend could answer, Jeremy's stomach lurched with fear. Spess, he hissed. It's Mary Lou. She's headed this way. How did she find us? Asked Specimen. I thought we did a brilliant job sneaking away after school. Jeremy didn't have time to worry about Mary Lou's tracking abilities. Just hold her off, he said desperately. Without waiting for an answer, he sprinted away. Jeremy Thatcher, you get back here, cried Mary Lou. Howard Morton and Freddie the Frog Killer were lingering at the end of the block. Oh, lover boy, what's the matter? Don't you want a kissy poo? Shut up, fathead, yelled Jeremy as he raced past. He regretted those words immediately. Come on, Freddie, yelled Howard. Let's hold the shrimp down so he can get his kiss. Whooping with delight, they joined the chase. Jeremy pumped his short legs even harder. The thought of Mary Lou's puckering lips gave him new speed. Even so, he could hear Howard and Freddie gaining on him. Taking a gamble, Jeremy left the sidewalk and began dodging through backyards. He could hear the voices of his pursuers. Putting on an extra burst of speed, he shot past everyone's laundry, down a long driveway, out to a street, and then around a corner. The shrieks and shouts began to fade, but Jeremy ran on until his aching lungs finally forced him to slow to a jog, and then finally to a walk. Bending over to hold his throbbing sides, he listened carefully. Silence. He stood to look around. A little prickle ran down his spine. I've never seen this street before. That wouldn't have been so strange in a city, but Bloggett's Crossing, where Jeremy lived, was a small town. I've lived here my whole life. How can I be lost? Feeling somewhat nervous, Jeremy followed the street until it came to a tree. He turned right and entered what began to seem like a maze of unfamiliar streets. Suddenly he noticed a trace of fog moving around his feet. The afternoon seemed darker than it had just a few moments ago. As he turned in a slow circle, trying to find his way home, he spotted an old-fashioned shop at the end of the street. Its large front window curved out to make a display space. Thin strips of wood divided the window into many small panes of glass. Printed on the window were the words, Elives Magic Supplies. S.H. Elives, Prop. Forgetting his momentary panic, Jeremy walked towards the shop. Who could resist? Maybe I can find something to make Freddie, Howard, and Mary Lou disappear, he thought, feeling deliciously cranky. He didn't really expect that, of course, but he was still excited as he approached the shop. A large brass knocker hung in the center of the door. Jeremy hesitated. Should he knock? You don't knock to go in a store, he told himself with a shrug. He pressed open the door. It swung open. A small bell tinkered up overhead. Once inside, Jeremy began to smile. The shop was dark and mysterious. It smelled of some sort of incense, spicy and sharp, yet strangely pleasant. Magician's equipment crowded the shelves, the display cases, even the floor. A section of one wall was given over to cages filled with rabbits and doves, as well as an odd selection of toads, lizards, and Jeremy squinted just to be sure. Yes, bats. He walked over to the cages and smiled in approval. The mild, musky smell told him the animals were well cared for. After a moment, he turned from the animals and wandered back in the back end of the shop. To his left was a shelf lined with top hats. Chains of jewel-colored silk scarves stretched across the walls and tangled from the ceiling. Directly ahead of him, resting on a pair of dark red sawhorses, was an enormous box made for sawing people in half. Jeremy spotted an old man, Mr. Elives, polishing a glass countertop. The man's long white hair hung around his shoulders. His walnut-colored skin was more wrinkles than Jeremy had in his laundry pile. Behind the man, a stuffed owl sat on top of the cash register. At least, Jeremy thought, the owl was stuffed, until it turned its head, looking directly at him, and began to hoot. Mr. Elives put down his cloth. Peace, you Willa. I know he's here. Jeremy turned, and he turned towards Jeremy and frowned, as if the idea of a customer was truly annoying. Well, what do you want? He asked sharply. Take a look closely at the picture. I'll try to show it to you as I read. Jeremy blinked. I don't think I want anything, he said. I just came to take a look. No one comes into this shop just to look around. But you can start that way. Let me know when you've found what you need. Jeremy could say that he didn't need anything. The old man picked up his rag and returned his attention to the countertop. What an old fruitcake, muttered Jeremy to himself, turning his own attention back to the display cases. In the first display case, he found a human skull that looked almost real. The Skull of Truth, read a hand-lettered label underneath it. Next to the skull was a collection of Chinese rings. Next to the rings, resting on a kind of pedestal, was a shiny, multicolored ball, almost the size of his fist. 1,000 different hues seemed to shimmer across its glistening surface. Hues, boys and girls? Colors. Jeremy turned his head slightly, and the colors shifted into new patterns. He blinked and looked more closely. The colors were moving on their own. How much does this cost? He asked. Mr. Elives glanced up from his work. You don't want that. How do you know whether I want it or not? That's my business. Jeremy wasn't sure if the old man meant knowing that sort of thing was his business, or if he was just saying not to be nosy. Whatever he meant, he was wrong. Jeremy did want this beautiful, ever-changing sphere. How much is it? He asked again. Mr. Elives sighed, shuffled over the display case. Do you have any idea what it is? Jeremy shrugged. Some kind of marble? Don't be a fool. Look at it again. Jeremy stared at the strange sphere. All right, it's too big to be a marble. What is it? Never mind. Jeremy swallowed. This old guy was even crazier than he looked. If he hadn't wanted to know more about the ball, he might have fled the shop right then and there. Turning his attention back to the display, he said, Can I see it? You're seeing it right now. Jeremy barely stopped himself from being truly rude. I mean, may I look at it more closely? The old man hesitated. After a moment, he knelt and opened a wooden drawer at the bottom of the cabinet. It was filled with boxes of all sizes and colors. The old man chose one lined with soft cotton. Next, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an enormous set of keys. He searched through them, muttering to himself, until he found the one that he wanted. It was long and black. Unlocking the glass door in the front of the display case, he slid it to the right, reached in, and picked up the ball. He placed it gently into the box. He stood and put the box on the counter. Jeremy swallowed nervously. Something strange seemed to be happening inside him. It's beautiful, he whispered, reaching up to pick it up. The old man moved as if to stop him, and then dropped his hand and shrugged. Jeremy lifted the sphere out of the cotton and smiled. It felt warm and comfortable in his hand. He wanted it more than ever. The old man blinked. A puzzled expression wrinkled across his face. Muttering to himself, he reached out, took the ball from Jeremy, and stared at it. For a moment, he seemed worried. Then he sighed and shook his head. Do you have a quarter? What? I said, do you have a quarter? You may have it for a quarter. Jeremy looked up in surprise. I thought you said I didn't want it. The old man looked directly into Jeremy's eyes. You don't want it. It wants you.